But it's nice to be able to, thanks, Dylan. It's nice to be able to see many familiar faces on this call again. I know some of us saw each other in Egypt and others in other places. And so it's nice to be able to have this space again. My name is Joshua, and I'm the Climate Policy Officer with PICAN. For those who have not met me, who've been lucky enough to have not met me yet. I thought we'd start by first acknowledging just this past couple of weeks that we've had, and the amount of work that has gone into both preparing for COP27, but also actually engaging in COP27, how draining that can be on our energy levels and straining. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work and effort put in by everyone on this call and others who are not able to join us. We've had some significant wins and many things that we can celebrate, and we're grateful to be able to celebrate it. I hope that it's okay with everyone that today's meeting is recorded and that it is also being live streamed for those who are not able to join us on the Zoom platform. And if there's anyone who feels uncomfortable with that, if you could please message us and we will try and work in some adjustments. We've got, hi Salita and team. We've got Dylan, who is providing some amazing tech support in the background. And so we'll be able to work around certain issues that might come up. In terms of setting the safe space for today, please, if you could rename yourselves, if you could put down your names so that we know who all is joining the call. If you feel comfortable to do so, we'd also love if you could add your pronouns just so that we don't misgender anyone. We want you to feel like this is a safe space. So while it is meant to be an informal and general discussion, we want to let you know that it is being facilitated. And so we will make sure that we are speaking our truth while also being aware of others in the room and taking care of each other. And so we encourage you to be able to share your perspectives and your opinions while also contributing to the healthy, safe space that we want to set up for today's call. We've set up the agenda for today so that it's in 3 parts. PICAN has a gender working group and it has a loss and damage working group. And those are the 2 main working groups that we've got. And so we thought that we would focus our conversations for today on that. So we will have a discussion on loss and damage, the wins of loss and damage, the losses, what we can do moving forward. And we'll do the same for the gender component. But before that, we will have a general overview, and Langi will give that. So over to you, Langi.
Bulavinaka, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this COP debrief and also just a reflection session. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our other 2 speakers, Dr. Sivan and also Tamani. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging and just reiterating what Joshua had shared, acknowledging our Pacific Island representatives at COP27, the negotiators, and also our civil society and observer delegates. Despite the brutal 2 weeks of COP27 and the challenging context that this COP was hosted, the Pacific really made their presence known. We made our positions clear, and we had our demands amplified and our voices heard. From the outside actions to the march and the stand-up protests to the side events, the many bilateral meetings, the daily coordination meetings, the strategy meetings, the media ops and interviews, all the way right through to the inside tracks, where the negotiations were happening and those who were involved in the negotiations and tracking the negotiations, which often, went through late into the night. It was good to see the solidarity from the Pacific. I think I wanted to also share from observation that this year's COP, many of the Pacific civil society delegates especially, had party badges, or either party badges or party overflow badges, which is a really good sign to show that there's a increased collaboration and communication with national governments and the recognition of civil society organizations at these multilateral spaces and the key role that they play. So it was good to see that almost half, in fact, sorry, not almost, but over half of the Pacific CSO delegates were on party overflow badges. My task this afternoon is to provide a bit of an overview of COP27, which was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. COP27 was dubbed the African COP. It was to provide an opportunity to table some of the critical issues, not only that were critical to the continent of Africa, but also to climate vulnerable countries. It was also dubbed the COP of implementation, where pledges would be translated into action on the ground. It took place in a country, which most of you would know has a record of, human rights violations, in a country which currently holds over 65,000 political prisoners in its prison. And it happened in a context where there are cases of delegates being subjected to intimidation, harassment, and surveillance, even to the points where the UN experts that were on the ground had issued a joint letter to express their deepest concern about the reported acts of harassment and intimidation by the Egyptian officials that were infringing the rights of human rights and environmental defenders, including their rights to freedom of peaceful assembly, expression, and effective participation. So it was really a challenging COP. That was the context in which we worked. On the key outcomes, COP27's outcome reflects a paradoxical but also turbulent yet powerful times that we live in. As we embark into this transition that kind of requires deep change across all the known structures that uphold the world's current economy and societies, the high tension and fast pace of change, the progress, becomes possible amidst, some of the historic geopolitical tension, while at the same time, the division that we see are still far from, the objectives of building, a safe and sustainable future. The COP27 package of outcomes, was reached in the early hours of Sunday morning on the 20th of November, and makes two historic breakthroughs that kind of reaffirms and signals confidence, although very feeble, the kind of political commitment to accelerating climate action and collaboration. So I'll let Dr. Sivan talk on one of those, which is on the loss and damage. But there were other significant breakthrough, and the other prominent one, apart from the loss and damage, the establishment of the loss and damage fund, was that this COP included strong calls for structural reform of the international financial architecture, so that it can better serve both the climate and also the sustainable development goals. So overall, the outcome is insufficiently ambitious compared to the scale of the climate emergency that we are facing, and it's the outcome is also reflective of the deeper divides, the issues that delayed consensus and which ultimately prevented high ambition outcomes. In particular, there were debates over the raising ambition of the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, the phasing down of fossil fuels, and the questions around, who pays and receives loss and damage finance. And so these still demonstrate the deep fault lines that continue to dominate our international climate politics. The outcome also shows that the political will is not there yet. It does not yet exist for coming to terms, and there is a real risk that these divisions can continue to obstruct the action that is needed to put us towards a path of securing, the 1.5 limit, which is really the lifeline for the Pacific. We saw at this COP that there were competing narratives on the urgency for action and for 1.5, and the role of fossil fuels in the climate transition, which we continue to see dominating, especially the closing hours of COP27. The cover text does not call for the phase out of fossil fuel, despite the pressure from many parties, including AOCs and others. So the battle over what just transition for 1.5 degrees means, especially for the millions of people who are living in energy poverty, like in Africa, can be expected to have even more of a presence at COP28, when you have oil-rich with the oil-rich United Arab Emirates presidency already emphasizing the continuing role of oil and gas. We saw how the small island and developing countries and African leaders used the stage of COP27 to set out a visionary and transformative climate agendas. And these have really just been fueled by the political momentum around the urgency of unlocking the scale of climate finance, the need for rapid climate action and addressing the climate impacts, including through the global finance system reform. So COP27 has really sent a clear signal to the to government that further action and collaboration is needed, and also to investors, to the central banks, to the international financial institutions, really reiterating that the climate agenda remains an unambiguous direction of travel and critical path for delivering transformative outcomes for developing countries. We also saw at COP27 how false solutions gain worryingly unchallenged attention at COP27. We saw unprecedented access for fossil fuel lobbyists. I think it was about 636. Not only were they there at COP, but they were also given access to side events to promote these false solutions. And this, threaten, really threatens to undermine environmental integrity, distracting our priorities, as they continue to promote solutions such as, generating finance through offsets as a means of financing energy transitions. As countries grapple with how to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the hype around these false solutions will need to be carefully managed as well. We saw, the failure to recognize that climate objectives cannot be met without increased efforts to protect and restore ecosystems, and especially for our forest, which resulted in many parties conveying, a perception of protecting intact ecosystem as a sort of a nice to have in the climate action toolkit. So, that was one other, outcome from this COP. And finally, COP27 has really made it clear, that stronger accountability for implementation of non-state, state and non-state action is needed. The onus is both on the state and also non-state actors now to make real implementation that is both not only accountable, but it's transparent, but also detailed across all commitments. So these were some of the, I guess, the outcomes from this COP. And that's really an overview of what the 2 weeks had resulted in. So I'll hand back to Joshua. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lani, for that wonderful overview, and for really setting the scene for us before we move on to names. Before we move on to the loss and damage discussion, as well as to the gender discussion. Dr. Siobhan, are you on the call?
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you. Yes. So we'll move on to Dr. Siobhan, and folks, after we have heard from Dr. Siobhan and after we've heard from Tamani, then we'll open up the space and we can have a little Q&A session, and we'll invite you to not just ask your questions, but also to share your perspectives and your opinions, things that caught your attention, on any of the things that they raised in their presentations or in their interventions, or anything else that you feel you might want to add. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Siobhan for her to speak on loss and damage.
Thanks, Joshua, and thanks, Lungi, for that overview. I'd like to begin today just by acknowledging that I'm on Ngunnawal Ngambri country in Canberra, coming to you from the capital where I work at the Australian National University. But I've had the honour of being a negotiator for various Pacific governments in the loss and damage space since 2019. So what I want to do is just highlight today some of the work that's happened over those years and why this COP was so instrumentally important in terms of loss and damage. So let's start. So the first thing is, as Longi's pointed out, there's obviously been very strong climate science again this year released by the IPCC report, which really point to some of the huge climate issues for the Pacific. I'm not going to go over them in much detail because I'm sure everybody on the call is familiar with all of this work, but what the IPCC Working Group 2 in particular report did this year was really highlight that losses and damages are happening now. They're happening in a whole range of climate vulnerable countries around the world and regions, and they're particularly impacting the Pacific through these climate issues. What the science is now prepared to say is that losses and damages are happening now. That was very contentious in the release of the IPCC report earlier this year, and the US in particular really fought against the mention of loss and damage. But that's been critically important in terms of building the broader campaign around some of what happened in this COP. So as Lungi said to you already, this COP was badged the implementation COP, and I spent just over 3 weeks in Egypt working towards those loss and damage outcomes alongside all the other negotiators in the space. It nearly wasn't an implementation COP, and we nearly didn't get these outcomes in the loss and damage space. So I think it's really important that we start by acknowledging the kind of political leadership it took really to bring these outcomes across the line. And one of the main reasons for that is that the geopolitics that surrounded the negotiations at this COP were incredibly fierce. So in spite of that, we came away with 2 really huge outcomes in the loss and damage space. I'm going to start with the operationalization of the Santiago network because it's very important, and it's one of those things that's been overlooked as we get caught up in the launch of the loss and damage finance facility. So I want to speak to you about that first, and then I'll move into the loss and damage finance facility space. So the Santiago network was first established in Madrid in 2019, and it's designed to provide technical assistance to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. So the decision text from this COP establishes a network of organisations, networks, bodies, and experts to avert, minimise and address loss and damage at local, regional and national levels, and in particular in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the threat of climate change. So this is technical assistance. It's technical assistance that countries can call on from this broad network. And essentially what we did at this COP was create a process to start the proper establishment of the network and to select a host body that will support the Secretariat. So the Santiago network consists of a hosted Secretariat, an advisory board, and then this broad network of organisations, bodies, networks, and experts that are designed to provide technical assistance into developing countries. And I have here one of my colleague negotiators, the brilliant Angela from ILAC, and this is actually an image similar to the one before of the work we did at Bonn. So there's a huge amount of work that goes into creating these decisions. This was started in 2019 and we've been working on it ever since. So catalysing this network is a pivotal kind of moment in terms of actually making loss and damage into something so that people can access loss and damage support on the ground and at a grassroots level in communities across developing countries, and particularly those that are vulnerable to climate change. So the EU has already committed substantial finance into this network, and the idea is that hopefully a whole range of other countries will follow. So it's got an initial grant of 25 million euro from the European Union, and you know, there's hope that more money will flow and more technical assistance will flow. So why is this important? And this is one of the things that I think is really a pivotal win and a win for the Pacific. The composition of the advisory board has 2 members from each of the 5 regions, 1 member particularly from SIDS and LDCs, 2 members of the WIM ExCom, and then 1 member each of the Women and Gender Constituency, Indigenous Peoples Organisation and Yango. And that drafting of that final composition, including a chair for Indigenous people, came directly from the Pacific, and it came from work that we did out of Bonn into this broader conversation, really to try and mobilise some of the long-held demands from some of these key constituencies that they want to be involved in decision-making. They don't want to have the kind of peripheral role that they generally have at COP. So here I've got a picture that I took of the Indigenous people, local community and Indigenous peoples platform from this year. And to me, this is pivotally important because they are now sitting in the advisory board structure. So there's a direct relationship between the technical assistance that people need on the ground, representing these constituencies in particular, and the way in which the advisory board can start implementing those needs and those demands for technical assistance. So I think this is a really important decision. I think including those constituencies in the decision is something that I personally am very proud of. Okay, so let's move on to loss and damage finance. Again, a very big and historic win, something that the Pacific has been asking for 31 years. So at Glasgow last year, I developed the draft text as representing Fiji, and at the request of the Pacific leadership, to actually operationalise a loss and damage finance facility. That was very contested in the Glasgow discussions, and what we ended up with as a result of that was the Glasgow Dialogue. So in Bonn in the middle of the year, we attended the Glasgow Dialogue. There was a huge Pacific delegation. The problem with the dialogue is that it had no reporting requirements attached to it, and it didn't relate to any kind of decision text or agenda item within the COP framework. So at that point in time, AOSIS and the climate finance negotiator and I drafted text along with some of the other AOSIS lawyers to create an agenda item going into this COP. That was supported by the G77 in China, and that is, it was a direct letter to the presidency to request a specific agenda item to look at loss and damage finance. That was very contested at Bonn, and it's taken a lot of work to move those issues forward over this period of time, which was instrumental in the lead up to this, this discussion in Egypt. So loss and damage finance, and here I've kind of put it next to a fantastic Pacific dance that took place one evening, just kind of spontaneously at COP, and I wanted to celebrate it, right? And actually say this is really worth celebrating. So the decision text acknowledges the urgent and immediate need for new, additional, predictable and adequate financial resources to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. It decides to establish new funding arrangements for assisting developing countries, and again, have a look at that framing because it's very important in responding to loss and damage, including with a focus on addressing loss and damage by providing and assisting in mobilizing new and additional resources, that these arrangements complement existing sources and funds. So it's a very big decision. It's incredibly important because for the first time in UN climate governance architecture, we have this link between mitigation and loss and damage. So what it says is, we ask you to mitigate. We ask you to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. But when you do not mitigate, you need to anticipate that there will be loss and damages that occur. They are occurring now. They are occurring particularly in climate vulnerable countries. And so there is a responsibility that flows from that. And that is the request of loss and damage finance. It's to address the key gaps associated with loss and damage currently. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. So the way this works is that a transitional committee will be established to operationalize these funding arrangements. And the transitional committee will look at institutional arrangements. It will define elements of the new funding arrangements. That's particularly important. We don't have a definition of climate vulnerable countries. So this is going to be very contested in terms of thinking around how the funding arrangements flow. It will look at identifying and expanding sources of funding, and it will ensure coordination and complementarity with existing funding arrangements. And this was the key outcome of COP. This was the thing that the Egyptian presidency really held up as the kind of defining COP outcome. So in doing that, it is designed, the Transitional Committee is designed to map the current landscape of institutions, look at gaps within that current landscape, and the text related to this gap is very important because many of these gaps were identified by the Pacific. So we're talking about sea level rise, displacement, relocation, and many of these really deep-seated aspects of what we call non-economic loss and damage. And we know that these are key gaps in existing financial arrangements. So we don't currently have any financing products to address losses and damage caused by sea level rise. We currently have very insufficient finance available for issues related to displacement. So these are specifically named in the text. The priority gaps for which solutions should be explored, the most effective way to address these gaps, and then the broad potential sources of finance. So there is widespread agreement that the UNFCCC, the multilateral system, needs to provide finance into this arrangement, but there are a whole range of other financial institutions that also need to start considering these gaps around loss and damage finance. And then the composition of the Transitional Committee. 3 members from Africa, 3 members from Asia Pacific, including the COP presidency in each of those, 3 members from Latin America, 2 members each from small island developing states and least developed countries. Now, we petitioned the presidency directly for that to be 3 members. And that's not how it worked out. So there's a very complicated negotiation that happened around behind the scenes around that. But at the end of the day, the 2 members from small island developing states is what we move forward with. And the Pacific, many countries in the Pacific fit within the least developed country category as well. So the issue becomes, what do those seats look like? What is the work of the committee going forward? And here are some of the pivotal questions that I want to leave you with. Obviously, this is my work, so I would like it acknowledged into the future. But these are some of the critical issues that we now have to think through in terms of the committee structure. So from a Pacific perspective, we need financing to address loss and damage from slow onset events and from non-economic loss and damage. And these are critical gaps in the existing financing framework. And insurance is not an adequate response to either of these gaps. So there's a need to think about what those financing products look like. We need financing sources that need to be sustainable in the long term and need to be distributed equitably. So there's a real issue going forward about defining what climate vulnerable developing country means in the context of this new facility. And this was a crucial point in the negotiations, and landing the finance facility meant actually driving this language forward. But we don't have a clear definition of what this means in terms of financing. So it's something that the Transitional Committee will need to work on. Other principles around transparency of access, direct access, and a focus on climate vulnerable countries become really important. And there are long-running issues in the Pacific around accessing existing financing, adaptation financing in particular, through the GCF. So accessible finance is crucial. What that looks like, the more you build in procedures and risk analysis, the more it becomes difficult for small island states, particularly very small island states like Palau, RMI, Tuvalu, to access this kind of finance because of capacity issues. But moving forward, how will the financing facility address some of those huge barriers that we've seen in relation to existing finance? And then the final issue is that resources for loss and damage need to be additional to the annual $100 billion pledge for adaptation. So it's a separate stream. It needs to be new and additional finance, but we know that currently those adaptation goals are not being met. So how do we develop long-term financing commitments so the finance facility remains not just as an empty shell? And this is where working with a consensus-driven process becomes incredibly important, because unless you bring with you those large donor countries into the design of what this facility looks like, they will not fund it. So this is crucially important in terms of how we manage negotiations, how historically we've managed negotiations, and what they look like moving forward as well. So the finance facility is an incredibly important step. Operationalizing the Santiago network is another very important step. We now have flesh on the bones of loss and damage in terms of the UNFCCC architecture. These are huge wins, and the Pacific leadership and Pacific negotiators played a really important role in creating outcomes in both of those areas. So it's something that the Pacific should feel very proud of. But it is a first step, it's the next step in developing this kind of financial architecture. Usually these systems move very slowly. We have pushed as hard as we can to develop very tight timeframes around the finance facility. But here are some of the issues that remain. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Siobhan, and you're absolutely right. Building on and working on consensus is always a challenging thing, but I think that one thing that this COP has shown us, and especially with the loss and damage, is that it's not impossible. So thank you for that and for outlining those historic wins with the Santiago network and with the loss and damage financing. Before we move on to our gender discussion, we've got Sivendra on the call. We had invited him to speak to us very briefly on adaptation and mitigation. And I know, Sivendra, that you've got to rush off after this. So I'm happy to pass on to you before we move on to gender, and then we end with some Q&As and discussions. Vinaka.
Thank you, Jesua. I will just kick right into it in terms of some of the discussion. So by the way, sorry, as a matter of apologies, sorry for joining the call late. Incredibly honored and blessed to be on this call to share my reflections on the COP27 journey, particularly in regards to the adaptation. I'm not so comfortable to speak on the mitigation aspects, although I can give my personal reflections on that regard. So my name, those of you who do not know me, I'm Sivendra Michael. I was a negotiator for adaptation track here with this year's COP with Fiji government. And so I'm just going to quickly reflect on some of the big wins and also some of the big losses for adaptation agenda items. So in a nutshell, the agenda items for adaptation covered quite a spectrum of things. Initially, the GST function, which is the global stocktake, which is something that has been an ongoing discussion for a number of years on like Pacific Island governments reporting on the indicators for the global stocktake, and also having like plenary discussions and workshops on what are some of the information that needs to go into the global stocktake and the challenges in this regard. So on the global stocktake front, there was a couple of workshops that was facilitated in the informal space where we were talking about access to supporting and measuring adaptation funds, and also the difficulties around Pacific or IOC's positions around with the global stocktake around. There was four tracks with the global stocktake consultation. One was on the adaptation finance. The other one was having finance to actually monitor and report on the global stocktake. The other was concerns around the indicators, which was kind of not towards favorable position of many IOCs and them reporting. And the other one was about the cross-sectionality of this issue. So we followed very briefly global stocktake. Most of the IOC's position was quite common on this, which is around to progress on the reporting. How do we, streamline approaches to reporting? What is some of the support that we can get in terms of, assessing the way in which support is provided towards mainstreaming adaptation initiatives in the region, and so forth. The second agenda item within the adaptation forefront was on the NAPS, which is the National Adaptation Plan. Thankfully, we had Pepetua, who was actually, who's from Tuvalu, Director of Climate Change. She was a co-facilitator for this track. We had proposed some texts within the G77 position on the financing aspects of NAP. As you would know that currently the financing instruments fund or support the formulation of NAP, but does not fund the implementation of the NAP within countries. So there was a call from the G77 towards, mobilizing funding to support the implementation. We did receive a lot of pushback in the room amongst, as negotiators, we don't name countries, but we did receive some pushback on the text that was proposed. And it was then agreed that the paragraphs that was initially proposed on the funding modalities to support the implementation of NAPS, particularly for IOC's countries, PC's countries, were taken to the GCF room, which is the Global Climate Fund, for them to decide because of the sensitivities around the demands that was proposed forward. And of course, as you know, that COP is quite a trade-off situation. You have some of the decisions finalized way before others and some that are not finalized. So in the interest of waiting for the presidency to come across with concrete outcomes, we found out that the 4 or 5 paragraphs that were suggested for adaptation plans was condensed to 1 when it came back from the GCF room. And I think that was what was captured in the final iteration of the document. This was a big loss for us in terms of how it was worded. It did not represent the IOC's position. It did not fully reflect our positions as well in terms of what was asked for. And we all know and acknowledge that there's a big, challenge within this front, particularly for our country, Fiji, and for many other small island developing states. So in that regard, what we are hoping that there's some concrete progress that can be seen through other decision items or other discussion items within the adaptation National Adaptation Plan agenda next year to progress this further. Third track was on the GGA, which is the Global Goal on Adaptation. As you know, and I acknowledged before that the Glasgow-Sharm work program was actually established last year at COP26, and we have 2-year time period to actually, within the work program to come up with a framework. A win for us was on the need to, at COP27 was to, the presidency decided that we will define a framework to measure the goals achievement and enable the review of the progress over the next year. the decision to actually establish a framework or to develop a framework was something that was not well received in the negotiation process. So we actually went back and forth because many of the countries said we have 2 years to come up with an agreement whether to establish a framework or not, and we should use this time properly to come towards this decision. The concern, however, for us in the Pacific is it's a talk fest. Like it's a lip service. We continue to talk about work programming, about what do we want as an outcome of the global adaptation plan. So PCIPS and IOCs was quite firm that we need something concrete to come out of this COP, and there needs to be a decision item to develop some kind of guidance or structured approach going forward on the establishment of the global goal on adaptation through the work program process. The loss, however, I wouldn't say the loss, but the non-rectified position that was captured in the text was the decision to have indices and matrices to actually be part of the work programming workshops next year. And as you know, for us in the Pacific, having a global indicator and without doing a proper, I guess, a baseline analysis of where we stand is something that we are not ready to commit to. So we wanted mostly to iron out the themes, the principles within the adaptation planning cycle, and the cross-cutting issues that needs to be captured for the global goal on adaptation, for us to agree on this and the Pacific values that needs to be captured within these dimensions. So dimensions, themes, and cross-cutting issues was something we wanted, as well as the principles that grounded the framework going forward. But what we did have there was also a ask or call on the indices and indicators and matrices to measure the progress in this regard. So let's see for going forward for COP28 how the work programming meetings go over next year until the intersessionals in Bonn midway June, to give a proper and more robust report back to you, the team here, on this regard. The momentum, as promised on the GGA, was also quite slow and staggered because African leaders in the room was advancing their own strategy and wanted their own themes. And for us, Pacific, we are large ocean states, so we wanted, language to be also captured that reflected our position as well. So there was some back and forth around this as well in this regard. But we need to, from the CSO perspective, acknowledge that Paris Agreement has mentioned this. It's 7 years down the track, and the progress was rather staggered. So we needed some progress on this, and we are happy that there was some decision to, progress or define a framework on the GGA. The last 2 agenda items on adaptation, really quickly, was on adaptation finance. The call from Glasgow was to double finance, and this was repeated. But overall, the progress was muted when parties really needed to come together to implement this crucial element of climate action. We did not see the buy-in in the rooms. So what this looks like going forward is, again, around, I guess, tax. They wanted something around a review of the financing mechanisms for adaptation. That was not reflected. I think something Shoban had mentioned in terms of its reflection within the loss and damage financing elements, that was kind of discussed, but also not captured in the adaptation, but well captured, somewhat captured in the loss and damage agenda. I think personally, the presidency could have done more to push on commitment towards the adaptation financing elements, because this was something that was committed previously and was a decision tax as well, CMA 4 or 3, I'm not sure. But so basically, I felt that there could have been more done on that regard. So yeah, I feel that there was another major reflection or setback on on a request for the IPCC to produce a special report on the, the way in which the framework or the thematics of the framework, because currently we are using the chapters to develop the themes. Now I'm talking technical, but in reality, we all know that the IPCC has its own mandate and it has 101 requests a year, and it's not feasible. So for IOCs and most of us, we did not want that to be captured, rather just a review of the existing guidelines, which was again somewhat reflected in the decision text for adaptation. What's next going forward? I guess, as I said, for adaptation, we have a couple of workshops lining up for the GGGA, starting from February to April before the intersessionals 2, and then 2 after that before COP. I know that there will be, again, a big push on the way in which reviews of the progress on NEPs are going to be assessed. So on that front, I would invite someone that has more experience in this area to speak about it. But in a nutshell, I'm not sure how we're going to progress with financing for NEP. And there needs to be a more urgent push from us in the Pacific. Personal reflections. I thought that COP27 presidency could have done much better in this space. My hats off to Shoban and every other negotiator, Pacific negotiator on this call for your tireless hours, sleeping maybe 3 hours or less than 3 hours, getting called early hours of the morning to come and agree on text, despite knowing that there will be a pushback in the next couple of hours. It was quite draining, but I must acknowledge and emotionally share my sentiments towards CSO for being there and standing by us. I've actually found my strength outside negotiation spaces through the CSO spaces, and how they were there outside negotiation rooms, feeding us and making sure that our well-being was, prioritized. Yeah, even early hours of the morning, they could have chosen to go home and focus on their side session, but they chose to be there. And for me, that is what we call Pacific solidarity. And I encourage CSOs to keep driving this space, as mentioned, because these are the big wins for how we show up in spaces and how we bring the outside stories and realities in the room. I also thank the CSOs for also shaping our interventions in those rooms so that we brought those frontline truths when we were making the interventions. So heads off to Dylan, PICAN team, and the others that work behind the scenes, work tirelessly. Thank you, Nolene, and everyone that was continuously, throwing things on the chat so that we, were not absent outside on what was coming out in the global media. So we were also informed. And I believe that this is the solidarity that serves, that brings justice to the roles of negotiators inside those rooms. So I encourage that we continue doing this going forward. Yeah, and that is my personal reflection. And once again, Malo, and thank you so much for this opportunity to reflect. And yeah, once again, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sivendra. Deeply appreciated. Thank you for giving us that overview on that whole adaptation process and being in the room and the negotiations that have been happening and what it's like to be there at the scene. And for that resounding call at the end about the importance of solidarity. And I think that that's a wonderful note to end on. We were going to move on to the gender discussion. I might have this wrong, but I don't see Tamani on the call. I think that Tamani might have dropped out. Tamani, if you are there, and if I can't see you, please do unmute yourself. But otherwise, I think we might move straight into our discussion session. We've only got about 30 minutes left on our call anyway, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. And then if Tamani is able to join us after this, then we can give Tamani about 5 minutes or so. But I want to open the floor now and hear from our friends and colleagues who are here in this virtual space. If you have any questions for our presenters, or if you just want to share about your perspectives, your opinions, for those of you who were at Sharm el-Sheikh with some of us, or for those of you who were doing the incredibly exhausting job of staying online at very late hours of the night, supporting from the different Pacific locations that you were at. Please feel free to unmute or to put your comments and questions in the chat. I see we've got our friends from Shifting the Power Coalition. We've got Corinne that's on the call. We've got Oxfam in the Pacific, PICAN, all of these wonderful, wonderful partners who have been doing some amazing work with us. We've got a question from Corinne, and it's for you, Dr. Siobhan. She asks, could you kindly comment on Australia's role in loss and damage?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Australia and New Zealand were very much being a friend to the Pacific on these issues of loss and damage. There is, there's a complex set of questions that come out of our region about whether another UN facility is the right answer, given the kind of poor history we've had with the Green Climate Fund in particular. And I think, there's a complex internal conversation around this from an Australian perspective. The new Australian government is trying to work out whether it's going to re-enter that multilateral system and in what kind of way. And I think the loss and damage finance facility really precipitated a lot of that conversation for them. What I would say is the Pacific leadership were very strong in saying that they wanted a loss and damage finance facility and they wanted it within the multilateral architecture. And as soon as they said that, and that maybe regional arrangements can also be part of that structure, but that it needs a link within this kind of UN climate governance system. And because that perspective was so clearly articulated by the Pacific leadership, Australia and New Zealand both responded to it. So they very much kind of led the conversation for us, particularly with the umbrella group. But I think there was still a very complex set of politics about getting a whole range of other bloc countries and specific countries across the line for the loss and damage finance facility in particular. And I think it speaks to the kind of the movement of the Australian government that when the Pacific leadership does articulate so clearly an agenda in the way that it did on loss and damage finance, the Australian government, now has much more of a capacity to hear that. So, obviously there's certain kind of things that I can't canvass on these conversations, but, overall, I would say that Australia played a progressive role in this space. However, I think it's also very important that people start to think about the calls being made from the Pacific, and particularly from Climate Minister Ralph Regan-Vanu, who is saying that if Australia wishes to host COP31 with the Pacific, they need to start addressing fossil fuels in a more meaningful way. And the Pacific leadership are aware, for example, of the fossil fuel subsidies that were included in the recent Australian government's budget. So, there needs to be a kind of consistency of messaging. 1.5 remains a critical issue for the Pacific. There needs to be real efforts made in that direction also. So loss and damage finance facility is one thing that was very helpful, I think, from an Australian perspective, and they really are adopting that, friend of the Pacific role. But mitigation is crucially important to the future of the Pacific, and that is a pressing issue, and it wasn't addressed well at this COP at all. I'm not suggesting that that was a problem necessarily caused by Australia, but the Pacific leadership is watching the Australian government very carefully at the moment.
Thanks for that, Dr. Siobhan. Is there anyone else? I noticed that Dr. Chris has joined us. Bulla, Dr. Chris, feel free to jump in if there's anything else that you'd like to share as well. You're quite popular today, Dr. Siobhan. We've got another question for you. And it's from Gareth. He's asking, how long do we expect this loss and damage text to translate into funds actually being distributed? Which is a good question.
Yeah, so there's a very careful time frame that is built into the decision text, and that is that this fund needs to be operationalized at the next COP. So that decision text currently exists. So the Transitional Committee has a huge amount of work to do between now and the next COP to actually build the fund in accordance with those key decisions that I laid out for you earlier. The issue is less about when it will be mobilized and more about how much finance will actually be contained within the finance facility. I think that's a crucial question. And then we have a history of the GCF, which actually took 8 to 9 years before finance hit the ground. And what is being really clearly stated by developing countries is that this access to loss and damage finance can't possibly take that amount of time, right? So that's why we've built the decision text in the way that it is to operationalize the finance facility at the next COP. But the question is, how long then before you can start seeing finance flow, and what scale of financing will be available? And the real answer to this, and I really want to pay tribute to civil society, because I think nothing makes a difference more than motivating countries internal to their own governments. So it's about building these connections into Europe. It's about building these connections into North America and retaining the kind of pressure in place in Australia, in New Zealand, across the Pacific, but more broadly in that kind of set of global alliances. That pressure comes largely from civil society. So there's so much groundwork now that has to be maintained to really keep up the momentum around the importance of financing the facility. One thing to set it up, but now the question is, how do we finance it? And I've been in conversations already with some of the more progressive leadership in that space who've already committed funds to the loss and damage facility, but those funds are very small relative to scale of need. So how do we scale that up? What does that look like? And how do we get it flowing? The multilateral system generally takes a very long time to do all of these things, but I think the message is loud and clear that we can't wait 8 or 9 years, right? So it's about maintaining the political will in this space and pushing, continuing to push. So this is what I mean when I say it's a really historic step, but it's a first, it's kind of the next step in the process. And now it's important to galvanize on that step and say, well, we've got the facility, but it needs to be financed. And adaptation similarly needs to be financed. So it's not about taking money away from adaptation and putting it in loss and damage, because that would be a terrible outcome. It's really about pushing key countries to maintain commitments in both of those spaces.
Thank you for that. Are there any other comments or questions? Yeah, Dr. Chris, go for it.
Hey, everybody, and good afternoon in the Pacific. I'm calling in actually from Brussels, where I haven't slept. We've had a very long day because today the ICJ resolution has been released. So after months of intensive work and coming out of COP27, where in the cover decision, there's actually a call for states to recognize and protect and respect their obligations on human rights, the core group has finalized the question and has moved into consultations on the draft, hopefully leading to a vote in the next weeks at the General Assembly. So I think COP27 was a really important milestone in again recognizing that human rights need to be front and center on climate action. And this question to the International Court of Justice will help clarify, first of all, what those obligations are, and also then the legal consequences if states don't meet those obligations. So a really important next step after we've now left Sharm el-Sheikh into the next kind of climate justice movement and campaign. So thank you to all of the PICAN colleagues and teams for the support. And now we need to convince half of the countries in the world that this is a worthy resolution that deserves their support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris, for sharing that wonderful news. I think that's often the case with processes like this, and I've been hearing that with a lot of the reflections, is that sometimes you come out of it feeling quite frustrated, but then you see wins like this and you hear about wins like this, some small and some large, and it makes it feel absolutely worth it. And it's important for us as civil society to celebrate all of those wins, because that's what incentivizes us to keep doing the work and to keep pushing forward. So thank you for that. Is there anybody else who'd like to share or to ask a question? I'd love to hear from, I don't know what others, but I see some young people on the call who I recognize were in Sharm el-Sheikh. And I'm wondering if any of them wanted to share some of their reflections, some from PISFCC. I see Tanya on the call. Miriam, who is supporting here in Fiji. Makareta. A lot of wonderful people. Dylan, sorry. But that's all right if there are none. I understand that we've all had a packed 2 weeks, and actually more than 2 weeks, because there's all the prep that's gone into it. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this call. It's been so amazing to be able to have spaces like this, and it's important to always debrief afterwards and to share our perspectives and opinions. Thank you to our presenters today. Thank you to Langi, to Dr. Siobhan, to Sivendra for taking the time out to talk to us a little bit about COP27 and help us make sense of this process. It was my first time at COP. I don't know, I think there are others on this call who were there also for the first time. A bit overwhelming to be in processes like that, but the wins have been absolutely worth it. And a reminder of the power of civil society. When we mobilize and organize together, we can create transformative change. So thank you for that. I know that we'll all be seeing each other in calls after this, maybe even in COP28 again and in the weeks in preparation to that. So thank you for taking the time out to be here today. And before we leave, if we could please have a photo, as Nolin from Diva likes to say, memory is resistance. So it'd be lovely if we could all just grab a quick photo of us before we disperse. So if you feel comfortable, if you could please turn on your camera. And we'll grab couple of shots. And I'll give it a second. Okay. Do the first one in 3, 2, 1. Perfect. And then we'll do another one in 3, 2, 1. Lovely. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, that you enjoy the upcoming holidays. Vinaka.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, everyone.